simple everyday transactions. These are issues where removing the legal order from them might be beneficial. Nowadays, for example, people for disputes as small as 1,000 euros, dollars, or whatever, they do not even use the legal system to resolve them. They just let them be. If we can automate these, not only we will remove a burden from the shoulders of justice, but we will allow people to trust one another even better. But there are other situations that are more complicated. For example, can we automate things like good faith or unprecedented circumstances or force majeure? I don't know. Think, for example, a situation where we enter a contract, but due to the COVID pandemic, everything that we have planning has completely been removed because, you know, everything was shut down. Can we automate such situations? I'm not absolutely sure whether that is possible, or at least I would say it is worth investigating further.
That's right. And let's really consider where this technology emerged from and what is it posing that will change. And really, all of this technology emerged from Bitcoin, which you might have heard about. Bitcoin is a payment currency. Well, not really a currency, but a digital currency. Some countries are now starting to accept it as legal tender. But besides all that, what Bitcoin proposed was the ability to remove the bank from the payment systems. So currently, if I want to transfer funds to you, even though I might use an internet banking app or a mobile app or a web app to send you those funds, really all of those funds are going to the bank. Well, they're already stored at the bank, but my request to transfer funds to you, that request is going to the bank, and the bank can choose to accept or reject that. And the bank will then send those funds to your account or to whoever I am paying. But the key here is that the bank is the central service provider, and there's nothing that we can do to get around that, even though it may seem automated. And what Bitcoin proposed, and we're only going to talk about money for a while, what Bitcoin proposed was the ability to have the very same system where you or me could directly send funds to each other, but directly, without having to go through the bank, without the bank having the ability to accept or reject transactions. And this is the idea of the blockchain. This is the mechanism that the blockchain provides, the ability for person-to-person services or systems where there is no single central authority. And if we consider the analogy of universities, of educational institutions, we have very similar setups. Our educational institutions, our universities, our schools are the central service providers. And every single action that we undertake as academics, every single action that our students undertake, the issuance of credentials, all the processes are governed by the university, and they can control the whole process. And we, as academics, other students, all have to abide by these rules and pass through the system. And some people now are starting to question whether we need to have centralized control over these processes. And not only over the processes, but centralized control over who owns what, over which student has actually qualified for a particular credential or degree. And this institution also is the one who will verify that at some point in the future. And we'll see that there were instances where this has actually caused problems when institutions were no longer around to provide for that verification. And there's the other issue of whether we can trust our institutions. Now, I personally believe we do have a lot of trust in our educational institutions, and we may not necessarily want to question that. But if we can remove the possibility of corruption, the possibility of mistakes, then blockchain provides a really good solution for that. And Jonas was talking about how the legal system currently is providing a similar mechanism outside of the university, right? But if you consider the university to be this legal system, it is exactly the same thing. The university has laws in place, has rules in place, and it needs to abide by them. So can we actually move to this future where we're minimizing the control that the central institution has and give less power to the decentralized institution and allow for the processes to be more transparent? Potentially. So what we are going to do throughout these sessions is, number one, introduce you to the technology and the legal ramifications of using this technology. And number two, after you understand what the technology is about rather than how the technology works, we'll go through a few use cases. So this is what Bitcoin proposed. It was this idea of decentralization. And Bitcoin, to reach this, to implement this, proposed the mechanism blockchain that allows for us to create these types of systems where there are no central authorities. And without caring about how it works on the inside, leave that for the computer scientists, for the geeks, and we can discuss that at some point if you like as well. But the main thing here is that we have the ability to create processes where individuals involved in institutions cannot cheat, where all records are stored forever and all records, all processes, all marks that are graded are auditable forever, and no one can go back in time and change that history. Now, if we consider what does this actually mean to the educational institution, what this means is that we can get rid a lot of overhead, a lot of admin costs. We can automate a lot of this, and we can focus our efforts on making the educational institution more efficient from other aspects that can't be automated. So this is the big vision of how to automate and how to make the educational system more reputable. But the flip side is that as people are proposing systems to decentralize the institution, to remove the institution from the equation, we have to keep in mind that the world does trust these institutions. So if I were to go to Jonas and show Jonas my University of Malta degree, he might say, okay, I trust the University of Malta. I trust that degree. We can have a certain level of assurance that Joshua has a certain skill set based upon that degree. Now, some individuals are proposing to completely remove the institution. So different individuals around the world could come together to create new types of credentials that we just together have come to create. Will staff out there, will employers out there trust these ad hoc credentials that are created without the centralized stamp of approval from an institution? To be honest, I mean, in the legal world, we have a centralized institution providing these stamps of approval that the society can trust. We have authorities doing this. Is this somewhere that we can move to remove some of the central power?
Yes, thank you, Joshua. In fact, what you have just been telling me reminded me a lot my experience 6 years as an academic coordinator of the master's program that I was leading in Hanover. Because much of what I had to do back in the day, not as an employer, of course, but as the coordinator of the master's, was to check the credentials of potential candidates and decide whether they would be admitted in the program or not. And this game between a centralized institution and a decentralized environment, while you were talking about that, it really made me think. For example, one of my most dreading moments when I had to check credentials was when I had to check whether the degree obtained in a foreign country meets the standards that we were requiring in order to admit a student. And that was difficult. And that was difficult for two reasons. First, I didn't know whom to trust. Right? In order to solve this problem, the German government has created a centralized database where the Ministry of Education was evaluating the degrees that were coming from other countries. But could I trust this database? In fact, the Ministry of Education itself had a disclaimer on the website that it is not legally binding and that I had to make the decision eventually myself. Now I imagine, how would I perform the same task if I didn't have decentralized structures? On the one hand, I could go to the blockchain. I could open up an application and verify at least that the degrees that I have in front of me exist. But would I be able to decipher anything more other than that? By removing this added layer of a centralized access point, we might, on the one hand, create more transparency, but on the other hand, we might remove an essential source of information in order to be able to perform that task. And as I said earlier, even the German Ministry of Education was reluctant to undertake any legal liability for the content of this database. So in essence, the liability was resting on me as the program coordinator, who I would make the decision, because depending on what decision I would make to admit or not to admit, I was open to a legal action from the potential candidate. They could sue the university and, of course, me as well for making the wrong decision.
Right.
So, you know, on the one hand, I would feel relief because one of the most difficult moments was to prove whether the documents that the candidates were adducing were original or not, or whether they were false. I couldn't prove that.
Right.
Of course, I would see in front of me a stamped document, right? But I wouldn't be absolutely sure, especially if the document was provided in a different country, whether the stamps that I see there are legal or, you know, forfeited or not. Right? But on the other hand, without the centralized points, I wouldn't be unable to assess, even indirectly, what to do.
That's right. So clearly, these centralized points allow for us to rely on these external entities that are hopefully doing the right vetting and are giving us the right information to decide whether to accept, whether to not accept students. And ironically, this is something that we see as well in admissions, that sometimes we speak to students and we notice that certain students have the right aptitude, they have the right attitude, and you can tell this student will excel in this particular program. But because of specific rigid rules that are in place for admissions, these types of students don't get in. And this is where I think we need to start considering whether other types of credentials, verifiable credentials from the blockchain, and we'll explain soon why this might be a solution, could fill in certain gaps where individuals might be lacking from other degrees.
If I'm allowed, Joshua, a small story again on what you just mentioned. Again, going back to my days as a legal master's program coordinator, I remember a considerable amount of computer scientists that were excited to do the program, but there were rigid limitations. The program was only open to people that had a law degree. You cannot imagine how many excellent candidates I had to reject, you know, candidates that had excellent applications, that just by reading them, I could see that they understand more about law and technology in comparison to candidates that had only a legal degree. That's in fact, I still remember the email I received from one of them. And at some point, I understand his fury when I had to tell him, I know, but I cannot accept you because according to university rules, you need to have a law degree and you don't. For all the beauty of your application. And I remember him replying to me, so you're telling me that the law tells you to accept semi-literate lawyers instead of well-educated computer scientists in a program of computers and law.
Indeed, and we need a solution to this. We need to empower our educators. We need to empower our administration to be able to make well-informed decisions in regards to who to let in, who to progress, and to get around these rigid rules. But let's go back to blockchain existing systems. If we reconsider the application of Bitcoin, and we'll see how this simple money system then translates into our educational systems. If we consider today how we use the bank system again, so let's say I have $10 and I want to send you my $10. Like I said before, we have to send that information to the bank will accept it and send it to, let's say, you. So this is me and this is you, and I'm sending you that $1. Now, imagine that there's someone working at the bank, or there's a hacker, or whoever it may be. There's someone who has access to this centralized computer. And this might not necessarily be one computer, it could be many computers connected to each other, but the reality is they're all controlled by the bank, by a single entity or minimal group of entities. It is possible for a hacker, for an individual, to undertake some malicious activity and just steal all my money away from me. And this is because in systems, we store information in databases. And all we would need to do is change some of that data, and I lost my money. Now, this is what the blockchain proposed to get around this problem, where there are different what we call nodes. They're nothing more than computers. And I have run my node, so you run your node, I run my node, Jonas runs his node, And everyone is running their own nodes. Now, forget a bit about the problems of having to run a computer node. But everyone is allowed to run one of these nodes. And what are we doing? What we're doing is replicating all of the data. So all of the transactions that have ever taken place, every single one of us is going to have the same set of data. All transactions that have ever took place. And this means, yes, that my transactions are available on everyone else's computer. And we'll come back to why that might be an issue. But all this data is replicated. So if you decide to change something, or I decide, you know what, I'm going to steal some money from you. Or if we're talking about an educational system, I'm going to reduce your grades because I don't like you. So I try to go into this data and change it. Now, if this was a centralized system like the one I talked about before, we can do that. Using the blockchain, we can't because everyone else has the data. And this might make you think, yeah, but once we already do that, we can share Excel files between all of us. So what the blockchain provides is the mechanism that even if you change your data, just like you can change your copy of your Excel, the blockchain will figure it out and will kick you out of the network. It will not accept that change. This is the genius mechanism that is blockchain, that it will find, verify any changes that are not valid and remove them completely from the network. So this is what the blockchain provides. And if we're talking about an educational system where we're storing different records, where you have on your computer, you have the fact that I have a degree in a particular area or I failed a degree, I think that raises some information, some potential questions about confidentiality. Should we be allowing that? Jonas, I mean, are there questions of whether this goes against GDPR?
Several, quite several. There is, and the problem is also that unfortunately there is no silver bullet. There is not a single data set that you can name me and I can tell you in random whether you can have access on it or not. One of the beauties of working on regulation and compliance is that you never know, that you live in a permanent condition of uncertainty. The only thing I can tell whether we can have access to such information or not, I would say it depends, which is of course the most lawyer-like answer to give, but it depends mostly on why do we want to see the data. The GDPR, so to speak, makes a connection between our right to access personal information and the reasons why we want to do that. For example, if I am an employer that wants to hire you, I might have a legitimate interest to at least look at some of your information. For example, your credentials, because I am going to give you money and I'm going to make you part of my team and organization. But on the other hand, if I want to employ you, your sexual or political preferences shall not be my concern, shall not be my business. So we need to be in a position to judge that on a case-by-case basis. And of course, also to create a system that would allow access to information, being able to work on such uncertain criteria.
Exactly. And this raises the question. So I've just mentioned that the blockchain allows for all of us to run different computers as part of the blockchain, different what we call nodes. And this raises the question of confidential information. So can we not use the blockchain then for maybe areas like this where we are storing some confidential information, such as personal details in this educational system? And the answer is the type that I've just talked about, open and public blockchains, are not the best thing when you want confidential information to be stored there. So what can we do to get around it? We also can make use of a blockchain mechanism to make sure that no one cheats, to make sure that your university, your educational institution doesn't cheat, neither does mine, but we don't want all the information to be available for all the world to see. So what we do is we use private and permission blockchains. And what these are is the very same thing we discussed before, except for if people who should not have permission to this system try to connect to it, they're just denied entry. So what we could do is set up a network amongst all universities or participating universities that want to provide this assurance that they cannot cheat. And they will provide this assurance by connecting the participating universities together. In such a case where we're storing information on this type of blockchain, the guarantees for assuring that invalid changes can't be made are lowered than that in a public blockchain, because the more people who are part in the network, the harder it is to make these changes. But in this type of network, if my university wanted to cheat for some reason, or an individual at the university wanted to cheat and take away a degree from you, they would need to convince all the other participating members, all the other universities. And that is highly unlikely, right? It depends on the size of the network, but that's highly unlikely for this type of application to really bring all universities together to cheat just to take one degree away from one person. So this is the type of solution we can now start to think about, these private blockchains providing these assurances. And it all boils down to, in blockchains, is whether we actually really need this. Do we trust the university and we have full faith that it will not cheat in its systems? If that's the case, do not use blockchain if that's the case. However, if there is an element of whether an individual in the institution can undertake some illicit activity or manipulation that they shouldn't, then blockchain provides a useful solution to this. And there's quite a lot of terminology. Jonas, did you want to jump in there?
Just a short comment, because we mentioned the GDPR. The only thing to say here is that this is one of the areas where blockchain technologies can really fulfill the wish of the regulator and the wish of the legislator. Right. Building, for example, barriers to access to certain kinds of information by design is something that the legislator not only welcomes, but in fact, even actively tries now to support and promote. And let me also add, Joshua, that apart from data protection, whether one is authorized or not to have access to information also touches upon data security. Mm-hmm. And by being able to manipulate and create a system that will do that by design, it puts us in a very privileged position. Before blockchain, such possibilities did not exist, and everything was dependent at the wisdom of an administrative authority. And, sure. and you might assume that the burden on their shoulders is huge. What we discussed right now in this digital room might seem obvious to us, but might not necessarily be obvious to a public servant who is tasked on safeguarding privacy and security.
That's right. And Jonas is hinting towards the automation of these types of processes that we can automate. And when you think about it, in our roles in educational institutions, a lot of the times, there is a particular case where you have some input, for example, some students' marks, and based upon their different marks, you need to calculate their final average score and their classification. And there's room for some error here, or there might be some rules that you need to look at from the registrar's office or the bylaws. But the thing is, all of these rules, all of these processes are set in stone according to the rules of the university, the laws. And yet we're often required to call up a department, a registrar, and ask them, how do we proceed from here? That means there's room for error. But these types of automated processes that Jonas is hinting towards, all of these cases where we have rules set in stone, why are we still relying on manual processes for them? The blockchain can make sure that all these rules are abided by without any potential for error and without any potential for manipulation. So perhaps this is a direction that educational institutions should start to look into. Now, in this space, there's a lot of terminology, and I think it's very important for us to disambiguate some of that terminology. So we've talked about Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin, actually, let me just quickly change to text. So Bitcoin is the first cryptocurrency, the first software that allowed for me to send you funds directly, for you to receive them, for you to send funds to anyone you want in the world without a bank, without an institution in between having the ability to accept or reject those transactions. But Bitcoin is just one blockchain, and there are different types. of blockchains. So blockchains are the mechanism that allows for us to achieve this type of system where there's no authority, there's no individual, there's no entity that has control over the system. And there are different types of cryptocurrencies out there, but they use blockchains under the hood. So there's also cryptocurrencies, the term, which is very often said. And cryptocurrency is the very same thing that Bitcoin is. So Bitcoin is one type. It's like the US dollar is a currency. Bitcoin is one cryptocurrency. There are others like Ether, which is on Ethereum, but don't worry about, forget about that. There's other cryptocurrencies and they use blockchain, which is the mechanism that allows for us to implement these types of systems. You might have heard the term DLT. DLT is a distributed ledger. It is nothing more than the terminology we use to define what a blockchain is. So there are different ways of creating these, let's call them shared databases. And the general term is what we call DLT. There are other ways of implementing them instead of using blockchains. Now, each blockchain, each DLT can be completely open and public, meaning that that information is available for all of us to see. All you have to do is download the software and start using it. Bitcoin is public. Anyone can start using it. There is also, like we mentioned, there are systems where we have confidential information and we don't want that to be completely public. So each DLT, each blockchain can also be private. And in fact, we're part of a university blockchain called Bloxburg, which involves many different universities who have come together to create a system amongst ourselves where we will have data shared amongst the universities, but it's not open to the public to see. And what we're doing is we're building amongst universities a mechanism of trust that is built into the software, built into the system, and it allows for us to operate without trusting the other entities. So we do not inherently trust them, but the software guarantees that none of us can cheat. Now, it's not just about money, right? We've hinted towards the idea of storing educational certificates and degrees on the blockchain, but let's take another use case to help it sink in. Some of you may have bought property or rent property. Now, when we buy and sell property, there is a central registry, and that's in most countries, that keeps track of this ownership. The fact that I own my property in St. Julian's and I'm going to sell it to Jonas, that's going to be stored inside of a database somewhere, inside of the land registry. And so we have to file this with the land registry. And if Jonas, so this is Jonas who bought my property, this is me. If Jonas then decides to sell his property to someone else, then we're just going to add another record into the land registry. So we can use blockchain for any type of application that we want. It's not limited to money. And that's all well and great. But let's consider a bit of a more complex scenario where, imagine you're being rewarded from your educational institution. For every paper that you grade, you're rewarded in these new type of points. And for every time that you park in a special bay, what they're going to do with these points is they're going to encourage civic, eco, green, green environmental mindedness in the university. So you can use these special points that you've accumulated to spark in special bays, parking bays at your educational institution. And the less that you use your car, the more that you walk towards university, they will award you with more points as well. So there's this incentive scheme. Now, we can create a system like this where we're keeping track of who owns what. It's the same thing well we've talked about. Instead of Bitcoin, we're keeping track of these points. Instead of land, we're keeping track of these points, right? But there's a problem with this. We're now talking about something more than just keeping track of who owns what. I told you that if you don't use your car, if you walk it to work, you're going to be given points. What guarantee do you have that you're actually going to be given points? Right? There's a central entity back. You need to trust the university, the security guard, that you're actually going to be given these points when he sees you walking in. Is there a way around this? Is there a mechanism that can allow for us to remove some of this power that the university still has? Well, the answer is yes. So blockchain version 1 was really about storing information inside of the blockchain in a secure manner. The later developments of blockchain, how it emerged, also guarantees that these sort of rules can be automated and that no one can cheat. And this was implemented using what we call smart contracts. Now, smart contracts are nothing more than software that implements rules, and these rules cannot be broken. So every time that I walk to my office and a security guard had typed in that he saw me walk through the gates, then I would automatically receive my points. Every time I park in a special bay, it'll automatically deduct these points. Now, we can use this not just for this idea of parking, but for the whole recognition system of certification, of micro-credentials, of automatically generating someone's credentials and not allowing for anyone to manipulate in that process. And this is what smart contracts really bring. But at the same time, these smart contracts raise issues. What happens if something goes wrong? What happens if the code automatically gives someone a degree who shouldn't have received that degree due to a buggy code? Then there's issues of legal systems that we need to look into, legal recourse. Jonas, what can be done if this is the case?
And also to add to that, while humans can make the same mistakes, for example, a registrar might give a certificate to a person that is not entitled to. But in this case, we can recall the certificate. We can take it back. The university might make a public statement that this is not a valid certificate and so forth. But can we do that on the blockchain? Can we tamper blockchain in that way in order to correct such errors? And if we are not able to, because blockchains are infamous for their immutability, what mechanisms shall we apply in order to make sure that we will avoid such mistakes ex ante? And that is where smart contracts, and I like that you call them contracts. I know that it is debated whether they are or not. I do believe that they are, because as you said, it is software that makes sure that the rules are set in place. And that's what a contract is. The contract is individual rules that we have decided to set in place, right? By calling them smart contracts, it means that we give them the opportunity to operate within a legal framework, which might be beneficial, because contract law has so to speak, ages of experience on putting a framework on our freedom. Our freedom is good, but it might be misused. So having a framework around it that will not be suffocating our freedom, I think it would be welcome. And also, it might make sense to borrow from the legal system certain remedies.
Okay.
Something, for example, that might appear on blockchain, there might be a legal remedy to somehow correct it, even without tampering with the blockchain.
That's right.
We do have such examples even from the non-blockchain realm. And by the way, since you began this section by talking about land registries, I can only reassure you, using the example of my native country, Greece, how excellent it would be if we put such registries on the blockchain. You cannot imagine, Joshua, Greece has changed its public registry on immovable property since 1998. It is 2022, and Greek courts are still dealing with cases where registrations have been wrong.
That's right. That's right. We've seen, I've heard of very similar stories decades ago in Malta, where people lost their property because someone changed papers in a land registry. And yeah, that's scary. And the same thing can happen with our educational certification. So we need a better way to provide.
I mean, to give an example, right? It can't be hacked. It is a centralized point that it is rife for attacks. That's Imagine right. If somebody would be able to open up a central registry and start tampering with the documents that are there. In Greece, for example, in the land registry system that we use right now, contracts are uploaded on a centralized server. If somebody hacks there and starts tampering with the contracts that are uploaded there, what is going to happen? Probably somebody will own all the land property in the country or something like that. Yeah? And the same can easily happen with university degrees.
Exactly.
I have experienced that also. I have experienced that also in my academic career so far. There was a person at the University of Hanover who was a research associate. And exactly because he had access to the centralized system, he issued a degree for himself without having the right to do so. And you know, we were only able to indirectly discover that. It could have easily slipped away.
Exactly. That's it. And the previous point that we mentioned where mistakes in the code could lead to problems, and then potential ways to fix that is by including certain points of trust. So it's very important to know a lot of people in the blockchain space, they come from this ideology of decentralize everything. We do not need any points of authority, any trusted institutions. I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think the way to look at it is what institutions, what points of trust are working perfectly well, keep them as they are. What aspects do you think where there is potential to cheat or would be ideal to remove certain powers? That is where you focus on decentralizing. And if we were to consider a smart contract, just to give you a bit of an idea, what does this actually mean? So let's consider that we're creating a program, an educational program, and we are two departments, let's say the admissions department and the actual department who's going to handle teaching. And we want to split funds between the departments. And let's say we do not trust the admissions department to tell us full details of how much they sold courses for, and we do not trust them to disperse those funds. What we could do is we could write a smart contract where we say, pay. So we're going to create a button on the internet where someone pays, and let's just call it a button. And this will be translated into a page where you click, I'm paying for my funds. And this is the pay button. And when I, as an individual signing up for this program, I pay for it, what the smart contract will do is it will send to, let's call this the education department. It's going to send to the education department 50% of payments. And immediately, at the same time as well, it's going to send to the admissions department 50% of payment. And at the same time, it will send to the purchaser a right to enter course. Let's say that we're creating an online degree program, and it sends to this individual his access key to get into these Zoom meetings. Now, if this is implemented in a smart contract, which is on a blockchain, and a blockchain is this system where no one can cheat, no one can change anything once it's been coded there, this means that our department, our educational department, is 100% guaranteed to get 50% of the funds. And no one can stop it, no one can change it, not even the company you paid to create this software. There's no one who can intervene. And this information is also transparent. So if you do feel that the admissions might be cheating, you could look at all this data and you could see, no, for every single transaction where a student has bought a course, we've received 50%, they've received 50%. And a smart contract is nothing more really than that. These simple types of rules that are guaranteed to be executed in code and no one can cheat. So that is the most important thing to keep in mind, that we're removing this central power. Now, at this point, I think it might be a good time. If there are any questions of any sort or anything that needs clarification, so please feel free to type it in the chat or even unmute yourself right now. We'll just wait a few seconds, see if anyone does. Alex.
Hi, Joshua and Jonas. I'm enjoying this very much. As somebody who remains very much involved in the whole notion of verifiable credentials, one of the things I keep on hearing is you don't need blockchain for verifiable credentials. I'd welcome both of your opinions on the matter.
Definitely. So if we are trusting our university or we are trusting another company to provide this system that is providing verifiable credentials, then we have to keep in mind that whoever we're trusting, whether it's the university or this company, that they have full powers to revoke these credentials, to change these credentials, to potentially give you more credentials. So we all know about the educational institutions across the world that are handing out degrees for just some money. Is that the type of verifiable credentials that we want to trust? Now, if those are the types of systems that we're going to use, is the market out there, is industry going to trust the type of credentials that we're issuing from something where you can potentially just create your own credentials? That is the big question. If we're fine with that, sure, go ahead with a non-blockchain based verifiable credential system. But if we really want to guarantee that these credentials were issued from a particular institution who have signed it off, and that no one can manipulate this data, no one can change it, revoke it, then we need verifiable credentials on a blockchain. Now, I think this then leads to a very nice scenario that actually happened. So imagine this scenario. You go to lectures, you study and you sit for your exams. You graduate, and of course, you go out and you celebrate, or at least in pre-COVID times, we could do this. Now you might stay at home and celebrate. And you land your first job. You climb the ladder of success and you become the best accountant, computer scientist, medical practitioner, lawyer, whatever it is that you've become the best. And war breaks out in your country. And unfortunately, you need to leave due to war, and you settle in a new homeland. You go for an interview for a job, and remember, you're the best doctor, and you go for this medical interview, and you impress them. They really like you, but then they ask for your certificates, and you don't have them because your certificates were left back home. Not only that, the certificate registry was destroyed back home, and there's no way to get that certificate back. The institution doesn't exist anymore. You have no proof that you actually graduated and are a medical doctor and all the experience that you've gained. What can we do? Which, by the way, Joshua, I'm sorry to interrupt you, I can verify that this happened. You cannot imagine the number of Syrian refugees that wanted to apply for all kinds of educational programs, and it was impossible to verify their credentials due to the situation in the country. It was impossible either to verify the simple copies that they were carrying with them, or it was difficult to even adduce a copy at all. That's right. And it's a problem for the individual, right? So this individual can no longer prove what they are, what they've studied. It's not only a problem for them, it's a problem for their homeland. Now, suddenly, because no one can prove that they have this particular degree, everyone can claim that they have gained that degree, and it's just been burned. So I can go around saying, you know what, I actually graduated from that university when we had the registry. And like Jonas said, this is actually something that we saw. This is a problem that we saw over the past decade or two, and the solutions have now been proposed for this. So Malta was one of the first countries to put in place a blockchain-based educational certificate solution. And this was proposed by, at the time, a company called Learning Machine, and they created this platform called BlockCerts that would allow for any participating institution to register onto the blockchain the fact that Jonas got his law degree from this institution. And then at any point in the future, Jonas could go to a future potential employer and say, here's my certificate, it's on the blockchain, have a look at it, and they can verify it's actually Jonas's. And that institution, University of Malta, could be blown up, could be taken down, the registry could be gone, but forevermore in this blockchain structure that will be there forever is Jonas's certificate. And I think if we really want to empower our students, they should become self-sovereign individuals who carry these credentials with them wherever they are, and no one can take them away from them. On the self-sovereignty, if I might add another dimension, possibly, Joshua, and I very much like the question of Alex. It's really provoking because it really touches upon the central problem. Do we need blockchains? I think that's the most important question. And I think we need blockchains when we talk about trust. Blockchains are tools to enhance trust, and therefore they necessarily come into the mix when we talk about such problems. Another situation
where I would, for example, like to see self-sovereign students is the cooperation between different universities. I believe we might all have experienced situations where we send our students somewhere to do some courses, and then when they return, they face problems with the registrars on the recognition of these credits. And many times, the reservations that registrars propose is that we don't know what they have been doing there. If there is, though, a transparent, decentralized solution, which can remove any doubt that was casted on that, that might make, for example, mobility even easier. So there might be several areas where I would say that it would at least be to consider.
Indeed, definitely. Judith, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Hello, everyone. Giannis just raised the point I wanted to make, because when you started, you actually talked about that trust issue, and that is a prevalent perennial issue we have as humans. The concern I have, though, is once we organize in block, the whole idea of putting our credentials there, is there a possibility for a backdoor entrance for others to insert information that shouldn't be in there as well? Because again, you talked about security, and security is a very critical issue when you're talking about people's credentials and who is going to verify the verifiers of this situation so that it becomes full-fledged. My question.
Indeed. So the short answer is garbage in, garbage out, because actually a lot of people in the blockchain space will tell you that blockchain solves these issues. No, it doesn't. If you have a user who is still putting incorrect information into the blockchain, that information will be stored as the incorrect information, but it will be stored that way forever in an immutable and transparent manner. That if you are trying to cheat in the system, you as the administrator will have your identity as the individual who signed off that information, whether it was an error or whether it was intently malicious. And this allows for us, using this auditable and immutable log that can never be changed, to rectify these situations where another administrator might say, you know what, I think I've spotted a mistake. Here is the update to it. The old information stays the same, but here's a new record highlighting the fact that that old record is incorrect and this is the new information. Now, the tricky part is how do you create, how do you define these types of systems to have the right people with the right rules who can verify the verifiers and update this information when possible. And this is not a technology solution that we can use to get around. It has to be a social solution. In fact, in Malta, we have a similar system, not when it comes to education, but when it comes to verifying that this code is working correctly. In Malta, there's now an authority that makes sure that this code is working correctly. And this authority puts in place auditors who say, okay, this code is correct, here's a stamp of approval. But who makes sure that these auditors are working correctly? The authority does. So we have a watcher on the watchers. And these are the types of structures that we need to start thinking about. That's one way of organizing this, where we have, ironically, a centralized entity watching the watchers or auditing the auditors or verifying the verifiers. Another solution that is being used in this space of decentralization is having the community, having the collective to provide assurances. So let's say the University of Malta or your institution's academics collectively attest to the fact that Giannis really gave a lecture at your institution. So kind of like how TripAdvisor works, where individuals are rating and there's this collective rating system. This is another model that is being tested in this space, but it's not a technological solution, it's a societal solution that needs to verify this. Giannis, do you have anything?
I was just on the same line on the last point that you made, Joshua. You know technology better than me, so I wouldn't be able to touch upon technological solutions, but I think that in a system that operates at the level of transparency that blockchains operates, peer review could be a solution. And we, for example, we can draw a parallelism to open source software, when software was starting being open, which means more transparent in comparison to commercial software, there were always in the beginning accusations that there is going to be garbage in, garbage out, as Joshua mentioned. But the power of the community and the beauty of the community there is that the more eyes on an entry, the more fine-tuning and improvements, or the fact that an entry is stored in an immutable ledger, it makes an interesting premise to discover the mistake, because eventually, if data is recorded in an immutable manner, we're going to find an antithesis in the information, and we will probably be able to trace back what was the initial entry that caused the misunderstanding. Because, and that is the good thing about blockchains, it's not that, anybody can play around, so to speak, and do it like in the ancient times, where if you falsified the first document and then destroy it, all the documents that picked up the wrong information, they would be wrong and there would be no way to find who was the perpetrator. But now we can find the perpetrator. Is it a perfect solution? No, it's not. I do not imply by any means that this is a perfect solution or any kind of a silver bullet, but it is a way through a combination of regulation, technological solutions, and social norms to come to a functioning environment.
That's right. And in fact, if we start considering how society and how the collective can attest to these types of situations and can agree or verify or disagree with whatever was input, this is at the other side of the spectrum where a lot of people are saying, we don't need the centralized institutions, just trust the collective, trust the people. But it raises a very important problem that anyone, if this is an open system, then anyone can attest. If I want a degree or if I want to prove that I went to a particular lecture, I can tell my 100 friends, guys, please attest to the fact that I came to that lecture. And in this particular space, this is what we call the oracle problem. Oracles are the external systems, the people providing these inputs. Can we trust them? Can we not trust them? How do we decide who to trust, who to bring into the system to attest to certain events or data? And this is a big problem in the space that we're working on, but we're coming to the end of this session. And I think it would be great that towards during the next session, we'll focus more on what does this now mean to this new era of post-COVID training, of remote training and education, and how can blockchain provide a solution in that context? Ioannis, do you want to close off with that?
I just would like to share another question that arrived, Joshua. It's from Sanjana, who asks if it would be possible for universities to put a wallet system so that certificates are verified from any place and any time. Sanjana, sorry, I didn't ask for your permissions to share the question. I hope it was implied, the consent.
So technology-wise, it's easy to do. We can do this. The hardest part to implement something like this is going to be dealing with the educational institution and the educational institutions. And especially when it comes to technology, the amount of resistance that we receive at our own institution is phenomenal. So I think one of the key points is how are we going to educate our own educational institutions to come on board of this type of technology, but it's definitely doable. Excellent. So thank you for the link, Jody. We will have our next session. Gabriella, who's organizing this, will send a link around to register for the next session with more information. And what we'll do next time, actually, to give you some time to absorb this, is think about what we've discussed and what wasn't clear and what needs a bit more verification or repeating. And we'll start off the next session with a Q&A component, and then we'll move on to how do we fit this inside of this post-COVID educational credential era. Excellent. So thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And judging from the different countries that you are coming in, double thank you. That is really impressive.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.